now I want to spin it to the Bitcoin part of the conversation. And from what I've noticed when I post about Bitcoin on social media and just from like reading things that I feel like people who are not focused on Bitcoin or even investing in general generally have a disdain for crypto and Bitcoin. Would you agree with me when I say that like the general public dislikes all of it together?
I think that for sure there's some people that fall into that category. Other people, are agnostic, and some people even are sympathetic to it, right? It's the people who tend to not like it. I put them in usually one of three categories. They don't like the people who are constantly talking about it, so they've got an issue with the people, not the technology or the asset. There's a second group of people who basically they're pissed off. They spend hours and hours every single week trying to beat indexes or drive returns, and they could have just bought Bitcoin. And so they're like, who the hell are these people on the internet who just bought this Bitcoin thing and they beat me? So there's, I don't know if that's jealousy, envy, whatever, but there's some of that going on. And then the third is the people who it violates their worldview, right? I mean, I talk to people sometimes and I'm like, I can't believe you believe what you're saying. Like, you actually think the government is coming to save you, or you actually think, inflation is not that high, or, name your, kind of insane assumption. You got to remember, well, yeah, there are people who believe that. And so when they see this asset that seems to violate a lot of the things that they believe, it confuses them, it upsets them. And some of that can be like, non-finance things like I just described. Some of it could just simply be like, hey, I only want to buy assets that have cash flow. This doesn't have cash flow. Why does it keep becoming more valuable? Right. And so, like, again, that violates your worldview from an investment standpoint, and therefore could lead to some disdain. But look, who cares what other people think? Right. There's a lot of views I think that I hold that I know people disagree with. And I've always said that whenever I say something publicly, if there's a ton of pushback, not like controversy of like, hey, I'm saying something that is, rude or inappropriate or something like that, but like I hold some view, let's say in the investment world. A recent example is I said that I believe that Ozempic and other similar types of drugs are going to be seen as the next generation cigarettes. And a bunch of people were freaking out, right? And immediately in my head, I'm like, okay, I'm close to the truth, right? Like I'm actually like I'm hitting on something here. And so I want to pay attention. Why are these people pushing back? What do they believe? What is the thing that they see that I don't see, right? And what you end up getting at is there was actually a high degree of alignment in terms of it helps with weight loss, it helps with cardiovascular risk, like all these things. But then there's also alignment on the downsides. Like, maybe if you become dependent on this, it actually isn't good for you. Or yes, you are losing weight, but you're not losing fat, you're losing bone density. Like, there's all these like nuances to it. And so what you start to understand is like, okay, if I have a framework in my head that I hold an opinion strongly but loosely held that I am willing to put out there, and there's a lot of pushback from the internet, and I can find enough other, kind of people I trust and think highly of that are hitting around a similar thing, it's likely that you're closer than not. And so that just takes time on the internet, right? It just takes like kind of practice. It takes getting yelled at quite a bit to start to see that framework. And so Bitcoin is a perfect example. Every time I see people having an absolute, like aneurysm basically on the internet and they're freaking out, and you're just like, dude, this is just a piece of technology. Like, it really upsets you that much? Like, man, this may be more valuable. Maybe we're all actually have lower degree of confidence in this asset, and we should have a higher degree because of those types of reactions.
Mhm. So there's been a couple crypto or Bitcoin cycles so far, and the past one with the collapse of FTX, and how Bitcoin was in the spotlight for this one more than ever before. Was this the hardest crypto winter so far?
I think each one has a bunch of different, kind of pros and cons, right? In some ways, past bear markets, one of the pros was that the media wasn't really paying attention that much, and so there wasn't a ton of people yelling and screaming and kind of acting crazy. On this one, there was, right. Some of the downsides are in past bear markets. It's been very hard to convince people to still take a look at the assets or capital flow in, et cetera. This one, actually, if you look, like, capital flew, kind of poured in, right? There's still quite a bit of interest. It may not be interest because of things that people in the industry want, but there was still interest. And so, I don't even know if comparing bear markets to each other, like you're going to get to an answer as much as um, when prices go down on an asset that your conviction hasn't changed, historically, getting more exposure to that asset at a lower price tends to be a positive. And so we'll kind of see what happens over the next couple of decades.
That's kind of advice I gave to one of my cousins who I was trying to get him into Bitcoin. I said, just set like a weekly purchase limit and just forget about it and just see what happens. And now, after all this time, he's up on everything he's had so far. And it just takes out the volatility for these people who, they're not fully convinced. And it's just a good way to get your like toes in the water, right?
100%. Could not agree more.
Yeah. So the big talk of the town in the markets this year has been AI. It's probably drove the stock market higher, where it would have been a lot lower had AI not come into the hype cycle. Does AI affect Bitcoin?
Bitcoin is AI, right? Which again, like that'll trigger some people. But what is AI? Like, there's no true artificial intelligence, right? We're basically talking about machine learning and kind of computer code executing, right? And we're using computational power to do it at a scale, at a speed, and at a complexity that previously was very hard to imagine. But think about what Bitcoin is. Bitcoin basically is using computational power to defend a network. It is a programmatic monetary policy, right? So it's an automated system. And there's a lot of similarities. Now, it may be a really watered down kind of, elementary, example of quote unquote artificial intelligence. But again, when we start digging into like, what is this stuff? Really, this stuff ends up being the use of software and computational power to accomplish some task, right? And this whole idea of like artificial intelligence, yes, it's exciting, right? Like you go in chat GPT, start asking it questions, it answers in a certain way. You're like, man, it's pretty cool. Right. But same thing when you go and you use Bitcoin, right? You're like, wait a minute, I just transacted this and it didn't go through any sort of centralized party. Like, oh, that's interesting. Right. And then you start actually looking at where these technologies can merge. Right. And so, for example, if I have an AI agent, you have an AI agent, what are they going to do? Transact in physical cash? Like, no. So, okay, maybe they'll use electronic dollars, but if there's long settlement times of a day or two, how do you have automated transactions? So maybe actually something like Bitcoin becomes interesting, or stable coins, or whatever, right? And so I think that people want to draw really strict lines around these technologies and say like, no, this is AI, this is Bitcoin, this is this, right? And it's more so like, no, actually, a lot of this stuff, there's blending of the lines, there's graying of the differences, and that's actually a good thing for society and for humans.
Now, I've seen you say before that you think Bitcoin could be the next world reserve currency, but why stop there? Elon Musk is sending rockets to Mars soon. Could Bitcoin become the money of the galaxy?
There's some Bitcoiners who they think that for sure. I don't know, right? Like I joke that we're still celebrating when some of these people go to like low orbit. Like we still have, we got some astronauts we put out there. We went to the moon, allegedly, and there's a lot of people who are like, look, we're gonna get to Mars, right? And I do believe that we will get to Mars. And there's what's the timeline? That's the hard part. But like this stuff feels like we are making serious progress towards it. And so if you take that into account, then the question becomes, okay, what do we do for money? What do we do for governance? Like, everyone was up in arms when Elon Musk said that he was going to make the rules on Mars. Like, oh, the billionaires can't make the rules. And basically, like, I think I tweeted it even. I was like, okay, cool. If you don't want him to make the rules, you get there first. Right. Like, it's just crazy to kind of debate these things until we even have the ability to get there. But I do know that it would be very difficult to use traditional fiat currencies in space. Forget Mars. So yeah, it's probably gonna be some sort of digital money. But let's get there first, and then we'll figure out exactly which one it'll be.
Yeah, 100%. Brad Gerstner is?
I know who he is. Yeah.
So he's been going around and saying, like, with a new policy that he wants to see implemented, where the U.S. government would open up a bank account, excuse me, a bank account for every child born in America, which is 3.7 million per year, for $1,000, which would total $3.7 billion, which is like less than 1/10 of 1% of the annual budget for the USA. Do you think that's a good idea, first of all? And what if they did $1,000 of Bitcoin for every child?
First, if we're going to do $3.7 billion, we got to cut $3.7 billion somewhere else. Ideally, we'd cut $10 billion somewhere else and do 3.7, right? We got to get the budget under control. But I do like the idea, right? I think it's smart in terms of trying to set these kids up for financial success. And if I understand it correctly, he wants basically just to be invested in the S&P 500. I think, right, and just like kind of let it compound, which would be fantastic, right, and obviously would put people in a much better position than they are otherwise. But we got to balance the budget. We got to figure out where's that money going to come from. And then the other piece of it is like, does it go into the S&P? Does it go into Bitcoin? Yes, of course, people in the Bitcoin world wanted to go into Bitcoin. People in the stock world are like, that's insane. Why are we going to gamble people's future? The market's going to decide, right? I can tell you that I have a child. That child does not have S&P exposure. The child has whatever exposure I got, and that tends to be much more Bitcoin. And so, we'll see what happens, but it's almost like there is no quote unquote right answer, right? It's uh just getting a system set up, and frankly just giving every child $1,000, forget even investing it, right, would be better than what we have now. And so yes, if we could get a system where it could be invested for them, it could compound and put them in a good financial position, it's kind of a starting point, that'd be fantastic. He should get more credit, by the way, for the work he's doing. I mean, I know he's going on a lot of podcasts and television and stuff, and hopefully it catches on.
Yeah, I found a lot of what he says to be insightful. I love when he goes on the All In podcast with all those guys. It's very good to watch. A bit of a more technical question. So something I've wondered is, as I understand it now, the miners secure the Bitcoin network, and in 2140 or around there, no more Bitcoin will be put into circulation because that's when it finally winds down. So what happens to the miners then, and how is the network secured from that point on?
Transaction fees. So if you think right now in a block subsidy, you get, whatever at the current times. Right now, 6.25 Bitcoin per block, 900 Bitcoin a day. And you also, as a miner, can get paid transaction fees. Historically, transaction fees have been very low, kind of, sub 20% of what your revenue is. But I think it was earlier this year or end of last year, with Bitcoin ordinals, we actually saw transaction fees spike higher than the subsidy. So the whole point being like, if there's lots of people using it, then there's still revenue there. The good news is, regardless of what happens, I'll be dead. So unfortunately or fortunately, I'm not going to have to worry about that one. But that is the thought process is actually, I think every single person for the most part is going to be dead. So everyone listening to this too, your opinion doesn't matter either. But the thought process is that transaction fees will take over.
And with Bitcoin becoming such a major part of your career and identity really in the public eye, I thought it'd be an interesting thing to think about of like, what if Bitcoin was never created? Where do you think you'd be today? How would your career have gone differently?
I mean, look, I think from the outside, there's a lot of people who know me for the Bitcoin stuff, which is great, and I'm appreciative of it. But I've never really tied my identity to Bitcoin or anything else, right? I've always been almost to a fault, very focused on. I want to be as clean, clear, and independent of a thinker as possible. And so Bitcoin to me is a asset that fits into a worldview that I have, that provides a lot of asymmetry and kind of is this like counter bet to the consensus. But if it wasn't Bitcoin, there would probably be something else, right? And there's been plenty of companies throughout the years that I've invested in that actually fit very similarly into that framework. It's just that they're a company, and a company that ends up being competing with a bunch of other companies isn't nearly as maybe controversial or debatable as this idea of a currency. And so I always think about, like, if Bitcoin was just a company, right, would people be freaking out as much? Like, well, they freak out about Tesla, right? So that's like another controversial one. It's like, maybe, but I do think there's something about it being a currency versus a company, or like an organization or an entity that really triggers people. And we'll see. So far the critics are losing.